Well, thank you for having me back. I'm not going to tell a Mother's Day story. You might be expecting one. But I told my I Love My Mother story on Friday at the distillery. Now, Cuss Runner was a good old country boy from long, tall mountain stock. He'd been a member of everything. He liked to join things. He'd been a miner, a coal miner. He'd been a strike breaker. He'd been a Republican. He'd been a Democrat. He'd been a Kiwanian. He'd been a Rotarian. He just liked to join things. He said he always liked to join the side that looked like it was going to throw the first punch, because that's how Cuss was. He liked a good fight. There's a story about Cuss that one night he was in a bar, and he got in an argument with a fella, and the guy drew a 6-shot revolver and stuck it in Cuss's face, and Cuss said, "I didn't know what to do, so I punched the guy in the face, and when I did, he threw his arm up like this, and he pulled the trigger, and he shot a hole through the ceiling. So I punched him 5 more times." That was problem solving for Cuss Runner. Now, Cuss was married to Helen, and Helen was a member of my church, the first church that I was a pastor of, but they were that couple, and there's probably half of that couple here today, where one of the spouse members faithfully attends church, and Helen was the one that was always in church. Didn't matter what was going on, if we were having Sunday morning service or a Wednesday Bible study or a covered dish dinner or vacation Bible school, whatever it was, Helen was there. And Cuss was never there. And after I'd been at that church for probably, well, just about a year, I guess, I got a call from Helen, and she said, "Preacher, Cuss is in the hospital. Will you go and pray with him?" And I thought, well, yeah, I'll do that. Now, I had never met Cuss up to this point, but he had a pretty serious reputation, and I was scared of him. That's the truth. And I went to the hospital, and I walked in the room, and the first thing Cuss ever said to me was, "I ain't never had no time for preachers." And I immediately went on the defensive, even though that's the wrong thing to do. And I said, "Well, why?" And he said, "Because preachers always feel like they have to have the last word." And I was still on my defensive, so I said, "Well, that's sort of our job." And then I think we both thought that this was going the wrong direction, and it wasn't helping either one of us. So I took a physical step back, and he took sort of a mental step back. He took a deep breath, and he said to me, he said, "Listen, I'm 88 years old." He said, "I've had quadruple bypass surgery." He said, "I have a new hip, a new knee. I've lost 2 toes to diabetes. I've had a liver and a kidney transplant." He said, "Now, I'm still spry as a fawn, but the doctors have done everything they can do to my body, and I think it's probably time I started working on my soul." Well, after that, Cuss started to come to church with Helen every Sunday morning. He was there whenever the doors were open, doing what he could do, and he was really, obviously he had a hard life, by choice, and he had offended a lot of people in the community and done a lot of things that are frowned on, not just by Christian denominations, but by most religions in the world. And you know how it is when you know people. You're a church member, and you know in your heart that you should love and you should forgive, and that's great in the general sense, unless you know the guy, right? So there was a lot of dispute in the community as to how earnest Cuss's transformation was, but he was there. He was there every Sunday morning, and he would actually come into my office on Sunday morning when I was going over my sermon, not when I was writing my sermon. I wrote my sermon on Saturday night, and he would come in my office. He wouldn't knock. He'd just walk in, and he would sit down, and he would proceed to tell me dirty jokes. And a lot of times he had taken the time to illustrate the joke on a 3x5 index card. He had a whole stack of them he kept in his pocket. So now, none of those illustrations ever made it into my sermon, but they were good exegetical background. But now Cuss was, you know what? He was never going to be able to explain the nature of sin. He was never going to be able to map out for you in a clear and articulate way the relationship between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, how the three can be one at the same time. He was never going to be able to describe for you how Christ could at the same time be 100% human while being 100% God. But I thought that that was okay, because Cuss was trying to go to heaven, not Harvard. And then I got called away from that church to another church up in Charleston after about a year of Cuss's transition. And I'd been up there for about a year when I got a call from Helen. And she said, "Preacher, Cuss up and died. Finally." Now, I never knew exactly how she meant that. But then she said, he never liked that new preacher. He wanted you to come and do his funeral. Would you do that? And I said, I'd be happy to. And that's the truth. I like doing funerals. I know that sounds weird, but I would much rather, and I don't know if you'll back me, you don't even have to nod your head or anything, but I would much rather do a funeral than a wedding. I'll tell you that. They're a lot easier. And the fact of the matter was, nobody liked the new preacher. Now, this was a tiny little church in a tiny little town. And I don't know if the dynamics are the same in a big church, but when you're a pastor in a small town, a congregation, and again, I'm not trying to step on any toes here, so if I hit any hot spots, don't throw anything at me. A congregation can forgive a lot of pastoral flaws. Maybe your pastor isn't the best preacher on Sunday morning. I mean, I was a much better preacher than I was a pastor, I think. Maybe your preacher doesn't turn all of his paperwork in on time. Maybe your preacher is late for meetings. Whatever it is, a congregation can forgive a lot of pastoral flaws in a small town church anyway if the pastor gets out and does visitation. If the pastor goes out and sees the people who are homebound, sees the people that are in the hospital, sees the people that just can't make it to church any longer. In that community, if you were doing that, and I love doing that, people loved you. And the new preacher just wouldn't do visitation. He didn't even let Cuss come in the morning on Sundays and tell him dirty jokes. So, I mean, how could you like the guy, right? So Cuss didn't want that guy to do his funeral, and so I agreed to do the funeral. And I went down to the church for the funeral, and it was packed. That church wasn't any bigger than this section right here in front of me. There were big windows on the sides, and it was biblical, man. The windows were open, and the church was packed. People standing lined up against the wall, and then people were leaning in the windows. The doors were open. There were people all around the church because a lot of people knew Cuss, and a lot of people came to his funeral because they were interested to know what the preacher could possibly say. Because there was still a lot of question about which direction Cuss was going. And I didn't know either. And I've never been the kind of preacher that gets real riled up at a funeral. I'm not one of those slamming on the pulpit kind of funeral preachers that tells you, like, it's too late for Cuss, but if you don't straighten up your ways now, you're going to hell. I never thought that was appropriate for a funeral. I always told my congregation, if you want me to tell you to go to hell, come see me later. And so, and again, I didn't know. So I kind of stuck to those middle-of-the-road scriptures where Jesus says things like, my Father's house has many rooms. If you ask for forgiveness, forgiveness will be forgiven. Even those who come late receive the same pay as those who worked all day. Because again, and then I talked about how the fact that it's not our job as Christians to judge who gets to go to heaven and who doesn't. I know maybe even some of the good people of this church think that they are in charge of that. But you're not. Only God gets to decide who gets into heaven. It's got nothing to do with you, believe it or not. And I know that rankles some people, but it's a fact of the matter. And then I talked about how a lot of times I think we as Christians waste a lot of our good time. And instead of doing things that make us look good, we kind of get attached to things that make us look kind of dumb. I love being a guest preacher because I'm just going to get in the car and leave. But I remember I was a pastor when the Harry Potter books came out. And there were so many church people that just hated the Harry Potter books. And they said, if your children read Harry Potter, they're going to go to hell. And they're going to get turned into Satan worshipers because it talks about how to do magic in those books. And I thought, this is, what? In the Harry Potter books, they celebrate Easter and they celebrate Christmas. And I thought, of all the people in the world, Harry Potter is really not that dangerous to Christianity. Superman is a lot more dangerous to Christianity because Superman is an alien. And if Superman comes from another planet, then that means there has to be at least one more Jesus. And he has to be like a Krypton Jesus. And then Superman, you can kill Harry Potter. But if you put Superman on a cross, he would just be bored. But we let our children wear Superman underwear. And I think, and then what was really interesting to me is that there were a lot of Christian people that spent a lot of time just, they were out loud on the street talking about how bad Harry Potter was. And if we had spent even half that time clothing the naked and feeding the hungry, we would have looked a lot better in the world, And people would have said, well, all Christians do is feed the hungry. Okay, you know what? I'll take that. And so people were so upset about Harry Potter, but then you never heard a word when 50 Shades of Grey came out. And I think the reason was because nobody was reading Harry Potter. So I told the church, the congregation, about those sorts of things. And then I told them that, my dad says that there's two reasons people cry when they get to heaven. And the first one is that God opens up your checkbook and God shows you how much more you could have done to help the world. My dad says the second reason people cry when they get to heaven is because they get there and there are some people not there who we thought would be there. Now, I think there's a third reason that people cry when they get to heaven, and that's because there are people there who they didn't think were going to be there. So that was sort of a summation of my sermon. And as we left the church to go to the graveyard, I think that the general emotion was hope. I really think that the general emotion was hope that Cuss would go to heaven. But it was a selfish hope because in the great class of salvation, Cuss was the guy that kept the bell curve curving. And if Cuss could get in, the rest of us had a pretty good chance. So we got to the graveyard and, put the body in the ground. And, of course, Cuss was a member of everything. So the disabled American veterans were there, and the veterans of foreign wars were there, and the Shriners, and the French Foreign Legion. And by the time that part of the service was over, Helen, his wife, had about 12 folded American flags on her lap, and there had been 750 rounds of ammunition fired. And then it was my turn, and I went over, and I, commended Cuss's body to the ground, and I said the Lord's Prayer. And then there was one more part of the service. We went over to sort of an open space in the graveyard, and there was a guy there, and he had a cage, and in that cage there were 3 white doves. And he opened the cage, and the 3 white doves flew out. And they started to describe, a big circle around the graveyard. And that fellow said, "These 3 doves symbolize the presence of the Holy Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost here with us today, and display God's presence and love and peace. And as the doves made like the last leg of the circle, 2 of them started to fly back down, but the third one started to fly off toward the horizon. And the guy said, that third dove, it now symbolizes Cuss's soul as it makes its final journey up to heaven, where his sins will be forgiven and his body will be healed, and he will spend eternity in happiness. And we watched that dove fly off toward the horizon, and just as it crossed the tree line, a great big red-tailed hawk rose up from the trees, snatched Cuss's soul, and descended. And everybody turned and looked at me. Like I should have something to say about this, right? Now, I don't know where you went to seminary. I don't know what they taught you in divinity school, but we did not cover soul-snatching red-tailed hawks. And I opened my mouth, like I was just going to start talking until I said something useful. I mean, it's the way of my people. So I opened my mouth to just start talking, and I heard, from off in the distance, I heard the first words that Cuss ever said to me. He said, I ain't never had no time for preachers, because preachers always feel like they have to have the last word. And so I just shut my mouth. And I looked over at Helen, Cuss's wife, Cuss's widow, and she was just a tiny little country woman. Her head was down, and it was kind of bobbing like that, and her shoulders were going like this. And she looked up at me, and there were just tears pouring out of her eyes and running down her face in all directions. And she had the biggest smile I've ever seen. And she said, well, I'll be darned. She said, I ain't never seen nothing like that before. And then in that good, hard, mountain way, she said, well, there's plenty of food up at the house. Let's go put some coffee on. Thank you.